World of Warcraft. Tides of Darkness by Aaron Rosenberg. Chapter 9. Nekros! Zulu head chieftain and shaman of the Dragonmaw clan strode down the long corridor, glaring at every orc that dared get in his way. Nekros! He bellowed again. I am here. I am here! Necro's Skullcrusher limped out of a nearby cavern, his wooden leg clanking against the rough stone floor, ducking to keep from bashing his head against the low doorway. What? Zulu had stopped beside his second and glared at him. How goes the weapon? Zulu had demanded, leaning in close. Is it ready? Necros grinned at him, showing his yellow tusk. Come see for yourself. He turned and limped back the way he had come, and Zulu had followed, murmuring to himself. He hated this place. It was called Grim Batul, or at least the dwarves had named it so, but it had been one of their fortresses then. Now, it belonged to the Dragonmaw, and though its chambers were large enough, he despised the low-ceiling corridors and even lower doorways. Tall enough for dwarves, but barely enough for most orcs. They would have enlarged the opening, but stone was difficult to work, and they had little time for such frivolities. The fortress was sturdy, carved into the mountain itself, and easily defended, and that was the important thing. Necros led him down further into the fortress, and finally into a vast underground chamber. And there, chained to the wall by heavy links of dark iron, was a sight that still made Zuluhead catch his breath. Filling the room end to end was a vast figure, coiled in about itself either for comfort or from despair, yet still its wingtips brushed the ceiling and its tail lashed at the far wall. Torches glittered along the walls, their light reflecting from scale after scale, gleaming red as blood, red as flame. A dragon. Not just any dragon either. This was Alexstrasza, greatest of the Reds, mother of her flight, and the queen of her people. Perhaps the most powerful creature in this world, strong enough to destroy entire clans with a single sweep of her majestic claws and consume whole ogres in a snap of her mighty jaws. Yet they had captured her. Well, Necros had. The entire clan had sought a dragon for weeks, any dragon, and had last spied a lone red male flying low above the forest, nursing a wounded wing. Zuluhead had not wanted to think what could have injured such a majestic creature, but had made their task easier. They had followed the dragon back to its family's lair, a high mountain peak around which dragons flew like birds, dancing upon the air. They had watched that peak for days, unsure what to do next, until Necros announced that he had tamed the demon soul. Then, they had slowly, cautiously crept up to the top, and there they had discovered Alexstrasza and her 3 mates. The Dragon Queen had noticed them immediately and had killed 4 orcs in an instant, opening her mouth and dousing them with flames. But then Necros had stepped forward and subdued her by himself. He had only ordered Alexstrasza and her kin to follow him here, and they had. The rest of the Dragonmaw had sung Necros' praises that day, the orc who had single-handedly cowed an entire dragonflight. But the main warrior-warlock would not have been able to do so without Zuluhead, or the artifact he had found. Zuluhead wished he was able to wield it himself, but the demon soul did not respond to him or shamanic magics. It had only answered to Necros, and now the peg-leg orc was the only one capable of controlling it. But that was acceptable, because that meant it was Necros who was trapped here in these caves, and Zuluhead could fight with the rest of the horde. Not that peg-leg orc. Not that the peg-leg orc was fit for much else. He had become useless in combat the minute a human had severed his left leg below the knee. Most orcs would have killed themselves, or at least leaped upon another foe and died in battle. Necros has survived, though withered from cowardice or ill luck, no one could say. Zuluhead was glad. Necros had. Because though he had found the demon soul, Zuluhead had been unable to use it. He had been able to sense the power trapped within the disc, even before he had uncovered it in a small cave deep below the mountains. but that power had remained locked within the gleaming golden artifact. Clearly, something other than shamanic lore was needed here. Zulu had considered bringing the object, which he had named the Demon Soul, because he could sense the demon taint energy within it, along with other massive powers he could not identify, to Doomhammer, but decided against it. The War Chief was a powerful warrior and a noble orc, but he had no experience with or understanding of magic. Gul'dan had been another possibility, but Zuluhead did not trust the chief warlock. He remembered when Gul'dan had been young and apprenticed to Ner'zhul. Now there had been a shaman, wise and noble, revered by all. Ner'zhul had worked for the betterment of not only his own clan, but all the orcs. It had been he who had first brought them strange gifts of knowledge and power from ancient spirits, and he who had encouraged and cemented stronger bonds between the different clans. For a time, all had been good. Then, it had all gone wrong. The spirits had proven false, and their own ancestors' stopped speaking to them out of anger. The shaman had lost their powers, leaving the clans defenseless from magic attacks, and then Gul'dan had stepped forward. The former apprentice supplanted his master and claimed to have found a new way, a new source of magic. He offered to teach the other shaman, and many had accepted his offer, becoming warlocks. Not Zuluhead, however. He had not trusted Gul'dan, who had always struck him as self-serving, and those strange powers smacked of demonic. It was horror enough that the ancestors no longer spoke to him, and the elements no longer answered his calls. He would not sully himself further by consorting with such unnatural powers as Gul'dan offered. Zuluhead had not been the only shaman to refuse, of course, but most had accepted. And then they had changed, growing larger and darker, as if their bodies reflected the taint within. Their world had suffered depravations as well, the land dying bit by bit and the skies turning red. The Horde was forced to come to the strange world instead, and they had to conquer it if they wanted their clans to ever know peace again. Nekros has shown promise as an apprentice shaman, but Zuluhead had held hopes for him. But when Gul'dan had offered other magics, Nekros has jumped at them. The young orc had learned the warlock skills well, but something made him step away, leaving all that behind to become a warrior once more. It had renewed Zuluhead's faith in the younger orc. He had never asked what had caused the change, but knew it had something to do with loyalties. Gul'dan and his Shadow Council, or the Dragon Maw clan. Nekros has chosen his clan. After that, Zuluhead began to confide in him again, and to ask the warrior for advice whenever forced to deal with the warlocks. It had been to Nekros that he had brought the disc, and though maimed, the warrior warlock had not failed him. It was thanks to Nekros that they stood here today, ready to see their plans set in motion. "So," Zuluhead said, starting to walk closer to the great beast, "we have..." He stopped as Nekros extended a thick arm, blocking his path. "Wait," the grizzled orc warned. He pulled the large demon soul from the pouch at his belt, holding a large, featureless gold disc aloft. "Come," he called. Zuluhead watched a rush of tiny sparks appear from throughout the chamber and flew together, coalescing into a shape. The shape gained dimensions, depth, and detail, forming a tall, powerfully built humanoid wearing strange bone-like armor. Its head was shaped like a skull, but rimmed in flame, and its eyes were balls of black fire. The creature towered over them, as tall as an orc, but less oafish, radiating power and vigilance. "We will enter," Nekros told it, holding the demon soul before him. The strange creature burst into a shower of sparks again, scattering through the room, and the maimed orc nodded, for his chieftain had continued. Zuluhead advanced again, cautiously at first, in case the creature had not in fact left, but it had. Whatever it was Nekros held over it seemed absolute, which was good, since they both seen what could happen otherwise. One of their clan members rushed into the chamber at one point, bearing a message from Doomhammer, and had not waited for Necros to dismiss the warden. The creature had appeared from nowhere. Its large, fiery skeletal hands had grasped the unwary orc's head on either side. Flames had sprung up, then consuming the hapless messenger. Within seconds, his shrieking stopped, his body going limp as his head collapsed upon itself, a mere pile of cinders. Now, however, the chieftain was able to walk into the cavern unmolested, and he approached the Dragon Queen, stopping just beyond the reach of her chains. Her massive triangular head swiveled to watch him, those great yellow orbs staring unblinkingly as he studied her in turn. "Have you come to gloat then, little orc? Have you not tormented me enough, and harmed my children enough?" Alexstrasza demanded. Her jaws snapped in fury, but the chains held her fast, their natural strength enhanced by the power of the artifact. "Not to gloat," Zulu had told her, still awed by her sheer size and power. "Just to make sure all is arranged. You understand what will happen if you refuse us?" "That has been made abundantly clear," she replied, her words sharp with anger and grief, as she turned to look poignantly towards the cavern's far corner. A handful of pale objects lay clustered there, and though he could not see them well from here, Zulu had knew they were paper-thin and molten gold. They were the remains of an enormous egg, the size of a large orc's head, a dragon egg. When they had first captured Alexstrasza, he had refused to cooperate. Necros had solved the problem by seizing one of her unhatched eggs, holding it before the captive queen's face, and smashing it with his fist, spattering himself and her with the yolk. Her shrieks had all but deafened them, and her thrashing had knocked several orcs to the ground, breaking limbs on 2 of them, where the chains had held. And after that, she cooperated, albeit reluctantly. Anything to avoid seeing more of her children destroyed unborn. "You will not succeed," Alexstrasza informed him. "You have chained me, but my children will defy you and win their freedom." "Not while I have this," Necros replied, showing her the disc. He frowned, clearly concentrating, and the Dragon Queen's body ached in pain, and thin hiss escaped her clenched jaws. "I will kill you someday," she warned, and still writhing in agony, her eyes narrowed in both pain and hatred. Necros laughed. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but until then, you and yours will serve the Horde." Zulu had gestured, and Necros nodded, following him from the cavern. The queen snapped at air behind them, her act of defiance meaningless after their own show of power. Zulu had led the way down another corridor and into a second, even larger chamber. This one opened along the side of the mountain, and beyond it, fiery shapes flew, flashes of color against the darkened sky. "Release her!" one of them demanded, swooping close, claws outstretched, jaws open. "Release our mother!" "Never." Necros held up the demon soul, and the approaching dragon screamed in pain, twisting to say aloft as its body trembled and spasmed. The other dragons backed off slightly, though they continued to wheel about overhead. "Your mother is our captive, as are her mates," Zulu had shouted, knowing the dragons could hear him despite their altitude. "They will remain so. You and all your children will serve us, serve the Horde, or she will die screaming from the same pain you felt. And with her, your flight will die. For without Alexstrasza there will be no more red dragon hatchlings. You will be the last of your kind." The dragons cried out in anger, but Zulu had knew they would obey. He had seen the bond between mother and child, and it was strong enough to force them to obedience. As long as Alexstrasza thought there was hope for her children, she would serve them by producing litter upon litter of dragon eggs, and as long as she and 3 of her mates were their captives, and her children would serve as well, in hopes of one day freeing their mother. Zulu had grinned, watching the young dragons soaring above him. Even now his orcs were hard at work, fashioning leather straps and reins and seats. Soon they would bring the first red dragon down into this cave and fit him with a harness and saddle. He would hate that, of course. The dragons were fiercely independent, and no one had ever dared ride them before. But his clan would. This is what he had promised Doomhammer, and the war chief had been enthused about the project. This would be their secret weapon. The humans had troops and cavalry and ships, but they could not take to the air with the dragons under their control and loyal orcs astride them. Zulu Head could strike at the humans from above, then swoop back out of reach. The dragons were powerful foes physically, with their claws and their jaws and their tails. But it was their fiery breath that would truly devastate the humans. Fire would rain down upon them, destroying them and their equipment, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. With the dragons on their side, the horde would be invincible. And he, Zulu Head of the Dragonmaw clan, was responsible. Without these visions, he would never have found the demon soul, or sensed that it was somehow linked with the dragons. And without its powers, and Necros to unlock them, they could not have enslaved Alexstrasza. But they had, and soon the first dragon riders would take to the air, joining the rest of the horde and awaiting Doomhammer's command. Zulu had grinned. All was going according to plan. Chapter 10. There, Thane, look there! Kurgan Wildhammer wheeled Skyrie about and peered down where Farad pointed. Yes, there. His sharp eyes spotted movement, and he tapped Skyrie lightly with his heels. His griffin mounted cawed softly in response before tucking in her wings and diving down. The wind tugged at both of them as they descended. Yes, now we can make out the figures trespassing through the forest below. Trolls. They were as green as the forest trolls his people hated. Certainly, their skin blended among the foliage, but they walked the ground rather than skimmed the branches, and their footsteps were too heavy, too careless to be trolls, who knew the way of the forest almost as well as any elf might. No, these creatures were something different. Kurgan caught a clear view of one as it passed through a small clearing and frowned. Heavily built, but big as a human, with thick muscles and long legs and heavy weapons, massive axes and hammers and maces. Whatever the creatures were, they were equipped for war. He pulled back on the reins, and Skyrie lashed out her tail, rearing back on her lorn henches, spread her wings, and leaped upwards once more. Clear of the trees, and back into the sky. Farrand and the others were circling, their withered skin blending into the tawny pelts of their mounts. And Kurgan rose to join them, his braided beard and hair streaming behind him, enjoying the sensation of flight even under these grim circumstances. Off in the distance, he could see the massive stone carving of an eagle at rest, peering alertly and confident out at the world, which was his own home and the heart of his domain, Era Peak. Yet the sight did not fill him with the usual pride and joy, for it seemed far too close for comfort given the activities occurring below him. "You see, Thane?" Farrand asked. "I told ya, uglies in our forest." Aye, you're right," Kurgan told the scout. "They're ugly, and they're intruding. There'll be a lot of them, though, and they'll be hard to hit as long as they stay beneath the trees." "Are you just to let them trespass across the land, then?" one of the other scouts demanded. "Oh, no," Kurgan replied. He grinned at the other Wildhammer dwarves. We be having to scare them out of the open. Come, lads, let's get back home. I have a few ideas, but don't worry. We'll soon be making it clear to those greenskins they're not welcome in the hinterlands.
You there, Paladin?
Trolling glanced up as the elf slowed to a stop beside him. He hadn't seen the ranger approach. That didn't surprise him. In the past few weeks, he had learned how quickly the elves could come and go, and how silently. Illyria, in particular, delighted in startling him by suddenly speaking in his ear when he hadn't even realized she was back in camp. Yes, he had been cleaning his gear, but he paused respectfully. The Orcs are in the hinterlands, the elf reported, and they're meeting up with the trolls there. That last was said in utter disgust. Trollian had learned that the elves hated the forest trolls, and apparently the feeling was mutual. It made sense. Both were woodland creatures, and the forests here were not big enough for two such races. They'd been enemies for thousands of years, too, ever since the elves had driven the trolls from part of the forest and established their kingdom there on that conquered land. You're certain they're allies and not just crossing paths? Trollian asks, setting his armor off to the side. He rubbed absently at his chin. If the orcs and trolls really had formed a partnership, that could be trouble. The ranger snorted in reply. Of course, I'm sure. I heard them talking. They got a pact of some sort. The elf actually looked concerned for the first time. They're planning on striking at Era Peak, and then moving up to Quel'Thalas. Ah, that explained his agitation. Quel'Thalas was the elves' own homeland, and the trolls hated them. If they had joined the Horde, it made sense they'd direct the orcs there. I'll let Lothar know, Turallion assured him, standing up. We'll stop them before they can get anywhere near your homeland. The elf nodded, though he didn't look convinced, and turned away, jogging back into the trees and disappearing once again. But Turallion wasn't watching. He was already making his way towards the command tent. He found Lothar inside, along with Khadgar, Taranis, and a few others. The orcs are targeting Airy Peak, he announced as he entered. Everyone turned towards him, and Turallion saw several eyebrows raised in surprise. One of the rangers just told me, he explained. The orcs have allied with the forest trolls, and they're planning to strike Airy Peak. Taranis nodded and turned to the ever-present map covering the tent's large table. Makes sense, he admitted, tapping Airy Peak's location. The wild hammer dwarves are strong enough to put up a fight, so they will not want to risk attack from behind. And, if the trolls are with them, they'll want the dwarves out of the hinterlands altogether. Lothar was staring at the map as well. It'll be tough, taking the fight to them in the forest, he commented. We can't deploy properly in there, and we'll be forced to leave our ballista behind. He rubbed his hand over his forehead, thinking, Then again, they'll not be able to marshal their forces well either. We could pick off smaller groups of orcs and not worry about them sending full army in any one location. Plus, the dwarves would make strong allies, Khadgar pointed out. If we help them, they may agree to help us in return. They make excellent scouts and first strike units. We could certainly use them and their griffins, Lothar agreed, glanced up, caught Turallion's eye, and nodded. Rally the troops, he ordered. We're heading to the forest to save the dwarves. By the ancestors, there's a lot of them. They're like fleas, only bigger and better armed. Gudrun cursed as he studied the scene below. He and a full hunting party were on the wing, wheeling high above to get a better view of these new greenskins, and what he saw wasn't good. These creatures were marching fast and were already only a day's travel from Airy Peak itself. At first, he'd only seen a score or so, but then he noticed another group not far away and a third beyond that. The others had reported much the same, though these greenskins were spread out in groups of 20 or so. There were more groupings than they could count. Wild hammer dwarves were not afraid of anything, but if these creatures were half as tough as they looked, they could crush the peak by sheer numbers alone. Not that they sit by and let that happen. Kurdrin glanced around, and each of his dwarves nodded in turn. Good, he told them, raising his horn to his lips. Wild hammers! Attack! He blew a blast on the horn, and then slung it back at his side. already guiding Skyri into position with his knees. She responded with a fierce cry of her own, spreading her wings and rising up before folding them back in for an exhilarating dive. They plummeted down, and as they did, Kurdran unlimited stone hammer, raising the massive weapon high. But for the moment, his targets were not the greenskins themselves. Instead, he struck out, pounding the nearest tree solidly across the trunk. The impact sent leaves and berries and needles raining down, which startled the bewildered greenskins. Kurdran struck out at 2 more trees, and those sent cones and nuts down on the creatures, hitting hard enough to leave welts. The greenskins ducked, raised their hands to protect their eyes, but the onslaught continued as the wild hammer struck tree after tree, dropping foliages and fruit and nuts in a variable shower. The greenskins did not know what to make of all this, but they didn't like it, and they responded by taking the simplest solution. Since the trees weren't safe, they left them behind, jogging away from the threatening foliage and out into the nearest small clearing, which was exactly what the wild hammers had been waiting for. With a loud war cry, Kurdran led the way, his hammer at the ready. The first greenskin had time to glance up and half raise a large axe before Kurdran's hurled, lightning-withered storm hammer caught him full across the jaw, shattering the bone with a thunderclap, and sent the creature flying. "You're too ugly to be in me forest, you bastard!" he shouted as the creature fell. The hammer returned and Kurdran loosened it again, the blow smashing the second greenskin, and then Skyri's arc drove her back up as she raised her wings to carry them back out of range before wheeling about for a second pass. The rest of his lads were striking as well, and the forest was filled with hoots and hollers, curses and insults as the griffins darted past. Whatever these creatures were, they were not easily frightened. As he came around again, Curtin saw the remaining greenskins had their weapons up and ready now, and they gathered into a tighter cluster so the dwarves could not strike as easily. They had not counted on the aerial advantage, however. Kurdran whirled his hammer overhead and let it fly. The heavy stone had struck a greenskin right in the temple, toppling it with a loud crack like an iron-forged pistol. And as the creature fell, it pushed against 2 others who stepped forward to avoid being entangled. "Ha! That's taking you down a peg!" Kurdran clawed at the fallen creatures. Ugh. He was on them before they realized their mistake, his stormhammer back in hand, but let Skari finish the fallen creatures. Her powerful front claws laying one low, and a sharp hook beak tearing apart a second even as her wings stunned a third. The skirmish was over quickly. Whatever these greenskins were, they were slow and not used to facing an airborne attack, and Kurdran and his people were experts at striking those on the ground. The creatures managed to land a few blows, and some of his dwarves had wounds to tend, but they had lost no one, and left no one unharmed behind them. Only the few greenskins in this particular group had survived, and then only by fleeing back under the trees. "That's taught them to look up," Kurdran pointed out, and his dwarves laughed. "Back to the peak then, lads. We're sending out another team soon to take out another other little clusters. Mayhaps then they'll learn to give every peak a wider berth." "Get ready," Lothar whispered, as he slowed his horse to a mere walk. Since anything faster risked running into trees or being unhorsed by low branches, and now he drew his greatsword and held it before him, his shield raised on his other arm. "They should be close by." Turalian nodded and hefted his warhammer, riding to his commander's back left as usual. Kagger rode beside him, and the 3 of them formed a classic cavalry triangle. Though the mage's hands were empty, Turalian had learned to respect the magics his friend could wield in battle. Straining his eyes, Turalian tried to pierce the gloom of trees and see the quarry. Somewhere around here. "There!" He pointed ahead and to the right, beyond Khadgar, and his 2 companions followed his gesture. After a moment, Lothar nodded. It took the wizard a minute longer before he had noticed the flicker of movement against the trees in that direction. Motion too low to be a bird, and too steady to be a snake or insect, or whatever else infested this such forest. No, that flicker could only be made from something the size of a man walking through the forest, and the fact that it kept repeating meant either the same figure was circling back repeatedly, or it was a large group. The fact it was barely visible meant the figures were the same color as their surroundings, all of which added up to one thing: orcs. Got them, Lothar agreed quietly. He glanced back at Kagar. Let the others know, he instructed, and the young old mage nodded and backed his horse away quietly. Meantime, we'll keep watch, the champion told Tyralion, who nodded, and if they look like they're getting away, well, we'll just have to make sure they've got the reason to turn around and come back this way, eh? Yes, sir. Tyralion grinned and patted the haft of his warhammer. He was ready. He still got nervous going into battle, but he no longer worried about freezing up or turning tail. He faced the orcs once already, and he knew he could do it again. We lost Terralach, Iamor reported. Kurdrin stared at him in surprise. Ungus as well, the Wildhammer fighter continued. And 2 more are too winded to continue fighting. What happened? Kurdrin demanded. The other dwarf looked embarrassed for a second, then turned belligerently. The greenskins, that's a happen, he replied. They're ready for us. When we dropped towards them, they started throwing spears, and then they scattered so we couldn't target them among the trees. He shook his head. Your strike was lucky and took them by surprise. They learned, though. The ugly buggers aren't fast. Kurdrin nodded. Hey, not stupid, these greenskins, he agreed. And more of them than we thought. He studied the map of the hinterland spread out before him, and the markers he had been using to show where the greenskins were marching. The map was almost completely covered. Well, we'll just have to hit them before they can refract. Tell the lads to come in fast and hard, and stay beyond the greenskins' throws. They're working against gravity, and we're working with it, so we've got the advantage. Iamar nodded, but before he could say anything, Brethian burst in. Trolls! He shouted, collapsing onto a nearby stool. His left arm hung useless at his side, still bleeding from a deep cut near the shoulder. We were driving on a party of those greenskins when a pack of forest trolls jumped us, took out Moray and Shehan with their first blows, and knocked Alpin and Loken from the griffins. He indicated his wound. I took a nasty cut from one axe, but managed to dodge the second blow, or I'd be taken off me head. Damn, Kurdrin growled. They're teaming with the trolls then. Greenskin and Greenskin. And those trolls will be keeping us from using the trees. He tugged at his mustache in frustration. We'll be needing something to even the odds, and fast, lads, or they'll be swarming us over like ants on a beetle. As if to answer his statement, a third dwarf appeared to report. But this one, a scout named Dermid, wasn't wounded, and he looked pleased rather than worried. Humans! He announced happily. With a great mass of them, and they said they helped us fight off the orcs. That's what they call the greenskins. Ancestors be praised, Kurdrin rumbled. If they can keep those orcs busy enough to forget their new tactics, we can strike down from above again. He grinned as he hefted his stormhammer. Aye, and we'll be taking care of any trolls that get too close. They may control the trees, but we rule the skies, and our griffins will tear them apart and they're coming within reach. He turned and stalked towards the door, already whistling for Skyrie. Wildhammers, let's fly! He shouted, and behind him the other dwarves cheered and hastened to obey. Now! Lothar spurred his mount forward and charged across the clearing, bursting upon a pack of orcs. They rolled about, clearly surprised. They had been busy watching the skies, and many of them were holding spears instead of their usual axes and hammers. One thought to throw its spear at Lothar, but the champion was too close by then, and his massive sword swept out, shearing through spear and arm together, then looping back and removing the orc's head before its severed arm even hit the ground. Tyralion was right beside him, and his hammer struck an orc and shattered its chest. His second blow glanced off an orc's arm, which was enough to make the green-skinned creature drop its axe. He simply struck it in the head this time, and it crumpled without a sound. But Tyralion did hear a strange noise, somewhere between a cough and a laugh, and glanced up. A tall figure, taller than an orc and more narrowly built, dropped from the trees in front of them, and a spear held in its large, long-fingered hands. Its eyes were sharp and narrow, its features narrow as well, and it grinned at him as it jabbed with his spear, showing rows of pointed teeth. A troll. Tauralian raised his shield, blocking the spear thrust, even though it hammered his shield back against him hard enough to leave his arm weak. He responded with a fierce blow from his hammer, staggering the troll but not stopping it. The creature glided forward again, spear at the ready, and Tauralian spurred his horse forward, bracing his shield before it smashed into the troll's face and chest. The troll had not expected that crude an attack and took the blow full force, reeling back and shaking its head to clear it. Tauralian didn't give it time to recover, however. His hammer took it in the jaw and dropped the troll to the ground in a heap. Pleased with himself, Tauralian glanced up just in time to see a second troll step out of the nearby branch. Its eyes narrowed in hate, and its spear was pulled back to a throw. Tauralian knew at once the weapon was aimed at him, and that he was not strong enough to block it or fast enough to dodge it. He prepared himself for the worst, closing his eyes and listening for the sound of the flying spear against the rising wind. Instead, he heard a strange, shrill shriek, mingling with a deep bellow, then a massive thunderclap, and behind that a cry of sudden pain. Opening his eyes again, Tauralian saw an amazing sight. The troll was falling from its perch, hands still clutched at the side of its face, which appeared to be crushed. Above it, however, a majestic creature. One Tauralian had heard of but never seen before. It was built like a lion, with the same tawny fur, but instead of a feline head, it had a fierce bird's visage, the beak wide and emitting the shriek he had heard. Its front legs ended in deadly talons, but its rear legs had thick cat-like pads, and a long tail swayed behind it. Great wings were flared out along its sides, and feathers covered its head and trailed off along its shoulders. And a man rode it like a steed. No, not a man, Tauralian saw, though of course he already knew. He had heard of the wild-hammered dwarves, though he had not met one before. Taller and leaner than their bronze-bearded cousins, the wild-hammers were still shorter and stouter than a man, with heavy chests and thick-coated arms. They wielded storm hammers like the massive weapons even now returning to the dwarf's hand, and clearly had been the cause of the troll's demise. The dwarf saw Tauralian looking at him and grinned, raised his hammer in salute. Tauralian raised his own hammer in return, then spurred his horse forward and targeted another orc. With the dwarf circling overhead, he no longer worried about an attack from above, leaving him free to concentrate on the horde. The orcs, on the other hand, had to worry about attacks from every direction except beneath their feet, leaving them confused and unnerved. And, as Lothar had hoped, the trees forced the orcs to move in small groups instead of a single mass, allowing the Alliance soldiers to pick them off one cluster at a time. Hours later, Kurjan welcomed the human leaders into his home. The commander was a big man, even bigger than most, with a good dwarf-like beard and a long braid, even if the top of his head was almost bare. He carried himself like a warrior born, and Kurjan could tell the man had seen more than his share of battles. Yet those blue eyes remained alert, and the golden lion head on his shield and breastplate still gleamed. The younger one, woeful, unbearded, seemed less sure of himself, but Zoran said he had seen him use that big hammer almost as well as a dwarf. There was something else about the lad, a sense of calm, that reminded Kurjan of his shaman. Perhaps the lad was a shaman himself, or otherwise in touch with the elements or spirits. Certainly, the third one, the violet-robed man, with the short, scruffy white beard, but the young man's walk, he was a wizard. That was plain enough. And then there was the elven lass, lovely and strong and lithe, as they all were, with her green and her bow and her laughing eyes. Kurjan had rarely met such interesting people, and would have been happy to do under any circumstances. Right now, he was even more pleased to make their acquaintance. "Greeting, lads and lass," he told them, gesturing to the chairs and stools and cushions scattered about the room. "Yeah, welcome indeed. We feared those greenskins, the ones you call orcs, would overrun our homes. There are so many, but your arrival put an end to that, and together we'll be driving them from the hinterlands. I'm in your debt. The big warrior sat in a stool near Curdran's own chair, idly adjusting the massive sword slung across his back. You lead the Wildhammers? He asked. I'm Curdran Wildhammer, Curdran replied. I'm the chief thane, so they'll go where I lead. Good, the warrior nodded. I am Anduin Lothar, former knight of Stormwind and now commander of the Alliance forces. He explained about the Horde and about Stormwind's fates. Will you join us? Curdran frowned and tugged at his mustache. You say they be out to conquer all the land? Lothar nodded. They came from the great black iron boats. Nod. Then they have been through Cosmodan. He decided, shaking his head. We've not heard from our kid in Ironforge for many weeks. I'd wondered why. This explains it. They had conquered the mines and used the iron ore to make those ships, the wizard said. Hey. Curdran bared his teeth. We Wildhammers have many quarrels with the Bronzebeard clan over the years. 'Tis why my people left Casmodan at all. But they are still our cousins and our kin. And those foul creatures, this horde, attacked them, and now it has attacked us. Only your time and aid save us from suffering our cousin's fate. He pounded his fist on the arm of his chair. Aye, we'll join you. We must be striking back at these orcs until this horde cannot threaten anyone. He stood and extended his hand. You had the Wildhammer's aid. Lothar stood as well and gravely accepted the clasp. Thank you, was all he said, but it was enough. At least we have driven them from the hinterlands, the clean-faced youth pointed out. Your home is safe. Aye, it is. That it is. For now. But where would those orcs be going next? Will they turn back toward Hillsbrad or go up to the capital city? Or be heading north to join the rest of their foul kin? Perhaps that had been the wrong thing to say, for suddenly his new allies were leaping to their feet. What did you say? Yowen last demanded. About the north. That they might be joining the rest of their kin. Kind, Curdran asked, puzzled. She nodded quickly, and he shrugged. My scouts say we saw but a fraction of the horde here. The rest turned north, skittered in our forces, and continued toward the mountains. He studied their faces. You did not know this? The clean-faced youth and the mage were shaking their heads, but already the older warrior was cursing. It was a feint, he said, almost spitting the words, and we fell for it. A feint? Me home without risk. This was no mere ploy. But Lothar shook his head. No, the threat was real, he agreed. But whoever commands this horde is smart, and he knew we would step in to aid you here. He took the rest of his forces north and left a position to slow us down. Now he's got distance for us. And now he's heading for Quel'Thalas, Yowen last cried. We have to warn them. Lothar nodded. Rally the troops at once and set off again. If we move fast... But the last cut them off. There is no time, she insisted. You said yourself the horde has distance on us. We've lost days already, and gathering the troops will only slow us down further. She shook her head. I'll go myself. No. The voice was quiet, but the tone broke no resistance. You will not go alone, Lothar told her, ignoring her glare. Thoralion, take the rest of the cavalry and half the troops. You're in charge. Kagar, you go with them. I want the Alliance presence to defend Quel'Thalas. He turned back towards Curdran, who was impressed. This man knew how to lead. There will still be orcs here in the forest, he warned. And we can't risk letting them get behind us as well as before us. We'll stay and make sure the forest is completely clean, and then we'll move forward and rejoin the others. Curdran nodded. I thank you for the aid, he replied formally. And when the hinterlands are once again secure, my warriors and I will be accompanying you north to deal with the rest of the horde. Thank you. Lothar bowed, then turned toward the elven lass, the clean-faced youth, and the wizard. "You are still here? Get moving! Every second you waste puts the horde a second closer to quell the loss." The three bowed and quickly exited the room. Curdran didn't envy their task, chasing an army and trying desperately to pass it and warn the elves of its approach. He just hoped they got there in time.